I am originally from San Juan, Puerto Rico. That's where I was born, and I lived there until I was approximately 22 years old. Went to school at the University of Puerto Rico, studied art history, and then went to do graduate work at the University of Chicago, where I did my master's and then eventually my PhD. But in between, I started working in museums in Puerto Rico, and at the Ponce Museum of Art first, and then went back to do my PhD in Chicago, and then went back again to Puerto Rico and was director of the University of Puerto Rico Museum at a very early age. So something that really served me to know that I didn't want to be director of a museum ever again after that. I had well, just a situation where I was going back and forth. And it was during my work in Puerto Rico when I started traveling throughout Latin America. And most of my knowledge of Latin American art is I acquired obviously through my graduate studies, but basically on my own because there was nobody really teaching Latin American art in the United States in the period in the late 70s and early 80s when I was studying. So it was really a combination of theoretical information that I gained on my own at the University of Chicago, and later traveling throughout Latin America and visiting artists directly in their studios, meeting museum directors, curators, etc., that I really started gaining the first-hand knowledge of this field. Well, before Houston, I was at the University of Texas at Austin, where I worked at the Blanton Museum of Art. I went there in 1989, and I held the first position that was ever created in the United States for a curator of Latin American art. The University of Texas at Austin is the premier center for Latin American studies in the United States, has the most important library specialized in Latin American studies, plus about 300 specialists from all over different kinds of disciplines. And they also had a Latin American art collection at what is now the Blanton Museum, which was at the time called the Huntington Art Gallery. And I went there to take on this position and to establish a program where I taught, but I also mentored many students, and really gave shape to the collection and to the program there for about 12 years. And from Austin, I was invited by the late Peter Marcio, who was director of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, whom I had known and met since I arrived in Texas. And he invited me to establish a Department of Latin American Art at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. And I, in turn, came with the idea of doing a research center, which Peter Marcio enthusiastically received. And we set out on a very grand and very ambitious project, which was to do a Latin American art department, which meant building a collection of Latin American art, of modern and contemporary Latin American art, doing large-scale research-based exhibitions, as well as starting this research center, which is pretty much the only one of its kind in the world. And so it's been an amazing ride over the last 12 years. We have a total of about 14,000 documents. This is the result of almost 8 years of what we call a recovery effort. Because what happens in the field of Latin American art, as we've been discussing in the past few days, this is an emergent field. And it's a field that until very recently did not have a very solid, scholarly or academic foundation. It's only in recent years in the United States and elsewhere that Latin American art is being taught at the level of universities. And certainly museums had not been collecting the art. The sources for this art have not been, for the most part, translated, and they are of difficult access. You have to go to the different countries and navigate your way through bureaucracies and other types of situations. And so it's always been a concern of mine and a number of my colleagues that it's important to have access to these sources if the field is going to really move forward and grow and mature. So in order to do this, when we decided to start out creating this digital archive, I think if you were doing this in any other discipline, if you were doing it in European art or American art, it would probably be enough to send, do a team, 2 or 3 teams, and send them off to the Library of Congress and certain large repositories, where they can gather this information. But in the case of Latin American art, we had to do it the hard way. We had to establish, I think it was a total of 13 ad hoc teams of researchers that were operating out of like 16 different cities in Latin America and the United States. And all of these apparatus had to be structured and organized from Houston. Houston paid for all the equipment, for all the salaries of all these people. Of course, we established, the first thing we did, we established agreements with different kinds of institutions, which was also hard because there's only one foundation in Latin America, which is Fundación Espigas in Buenos Aires, who is dedicated to research and who's dedicated to archives and to organizing archives of Argentinian and Latin American art, and whose primary mission in the world is to do that. That was the only place where we could establish a direct partnership with a like-minded institution. In other cases, we had to establish partnerships with universities, in one particular case with a bank. So, I mean, it was just, different kinds of situations. The primary objective of the program was really to access artist writings. We wanted to really get to the intellectual foundations of the art. The art has been in circulation and is increasingly, circulating all over the world. But we wanted to really get to the intellectual foundations of that art to show how Latin American artists have been incredibly good at theory, and how they have been incredibly good also at producing original thinking about art, because that's the part that people don't know. I mean, they think that they're dealing just with, extraordinarily good practitioners, people who do make, good art, but they don't realize that in many cases, there is an intellectual, a very solid intellectual foundation that in many cases is unique. And so that was one of the primary purposes. We wanted to access that. Yes, well, certainly many of these artists identify with the notion of the avant-garde as it was manifested in Europe, particularly. It's kind of a tricky concept because in the United States, this concept really did not circulate. And so it's harder in the United States to explain what the concept of the avant-garde is. But I think in Latin America, Latin American artists were very much tuned in to Europe, mostly for most of the 20th century until the later part of the century. And so this idea of the avant-garde was very much in currency at the time. And it's basically, the artists who feel that, they have to contribute something at the theoretical level, that they are intellectuals also at the same time as they are artists. And they are trying to push the boundaries of art in some way, or they're trying to integrate art into life. And so art becomes part of a larger, more utopian type of project. And what distinguishes the avant-garde in Latin America is the fact that obviously they were in touch with what was happening in Europe. I mean, Europe or the United States was the starting point in many ways, because this is what defines, unfortunately, all of the regions that are not central regions. All the regions in the periphery, such as Latin America or Asia or Eastern Europe. I mean, they've all been, they are all positioned along what I call an unequal axis of exchange. Everything is generated in Europe and then it goes, to Latin America, or Latin American artists need to, access what is happening in Europe and the United States in the centers before, they can actually be recognized in those places. So The starting point in many cases is the Latin American, I mean, it's the European avant-garde movements, but what artists from Latin America do with that, is something rather unique. Because usually, they start off from that premise, but they change or invert or subvert in some ways, those principles according to their local situations and the factors, that constitute their local situations. So what comes out of that is a completely original product, that has nothing to do, it's not derivative, of what the European avant-garde is doing. Latin America is such a diverse and heterogeneous region, and many times, it's important to bear in mind, many times artists did not have contact with one another. I mean, the contact was most of the time vertical. They were trying to establish contact with Europe and the United States, not necessarily with a country next to each other. But one of the things that happens in the archive is that you begin to detect common trends that are basically happening at the same time. And you're beginning to discover how certain artists actually had connections, with other artists, and they were in correspondence, or they were carrying on some kind of dialogue, and those patterns are beginning to emerge, out of the work of the archive. There is a consciousness of the social and political role of the artist is very much present in Latin America from the very beginning. And obviously that has to do with the social and political situation of these countries, and the fact that artists had to struggle, first of all, to gain recognition within those societies, but they also saw themselves as, sort of like on the more liberal or progressive, side of those societies. I mean, they were concerned with, the future. They were concerned with the welfare and the well-being, of citizens of those societies. And so you find that for the most part, I would say with very few exceptions, most of these avant-garde movements and most of these avant-garde artists in Latin America from the 1920s onwards. Well, I would say that practically most of the movements that were associated with constructivism, which is a very strong tendency in Latin America since the 1930s and 1940s, most of them had leftist ideological inclinations, and most of them had bought into this idea of the merging of art and life. So you have, for instance, the Grupo Madí in Argentina. I mean, they were sympathizers, of the communist and socialist movements, and not necessarily, belonged to those parties, but they spoke about it in their manifestos. You have the concretistas in Brazil, Valdemar Cordeiro and the group that operated out of Sao Paulo. They were also either sympathizers of the Communist Party at that time, and they certainly believed in the idea of the collective and of producing, for, almost not in anonymity, but producing for a society that was being rapidly industrialized, and where art had to play a role, within that process of industrialization, and that manifested itself, even though they themselves were not able to achieve it, in practice, but that it manifested themselves in the fact that, they had to contribute to that in terms of industrial design. And actually some of the works that they produce, the level of abstraction, it's almost, they were, for instance, they rejected, the traditional media of painting. They wanted to use industrial paint. They wanted to use industrial materials, things like instead of using canvas, they would use masonite, or they would use formica, different, completely non-traditional works. They would use car paint, to do some of their work, and or aluminum, and so there was that idea of the working class society and producing art, that would be useful, to working class people, and that would integrate, into their lives. It was much more an aspiration, than it was realized in practice, but it was there, and. So I think that most of these movements really participated very strongly because they, as I said, they were in societies that were significantly underdeveloped. And so it was a concern of the artist to become involved, with that social aspect of art and not live, just in an ivory tower, producing his art. So the notion of formalism was not something that these people really subscribed to. And in the case of conceptual art, it is very, very, very clear. And one of the things that in my own work about conceptual art that I have identified is a form of conceptualism that we might call ideological conceptualism. And I was not the first one to coin that term. That comes from the Spanish art historian Simón Marchán Fis. He had detected that in the Spanish conceptual artists, that were operating under the Franco regime. And when I started looking at the phenomenon of conceptualism in Latin America, which was a phenomenon that really developed under the worst military regimes of the 20th century. We're talking about countries like Brazil, Argentina, Chile, to a certain extent Peru, Uruguay. I mean, these countries between the early 60s and the 70s really underwent atrocious forms of military dictatorships and repression. And so artists resorted to these kinds of conceptual practices because in many cases they were dematerialized, although objects really were big in Latin America. It was not a dematerialized proposition at all. But they resorted to all of these conceptual propositions because they could escape, censorship. And it was a way of trying to reach people, by establishing chains of communication, that would go undetected, by the military police. And so the ideological factor is fundamental to the development of conceptualism. There is none of the more abstract or esoteric forms of conceptualism that you find in the United States and Europe. Everything, the idea of communication was fundamental for all of the conceptual artists who were working at the time. And it's very ironic because recently I had to go back to that research, which I did basically in the 90s and early 2000s, and sort of like establish a balance, what had happened, since then. And it's very clear that, and it's an irony, but the return to democracy really killed all of those tendencies, and made them completely irrelevant, because then they didn't have to really, figure out a way, an innovative way to communicate their messages, to the public, because censorship was gone, so everything else was allowed. And so then you begin to find how some of these artists start producing more formulas, for their art, or their art becomes divested of that very important social component. And in many cases, if you look today, I mean, it's been completely commercialized, So I think that there's an awareness on the part of artists throughout the 20th century in Latin America of the colonial past. And I think that that's something that they're all very much aware, and in many times, it's completely assimilated into their, whatever their positions and their proposals are. They're very much aware that Latin America is a product of colonialism, and that, that history has not been completely overcome at all. That's why, for instance, I personally don't believe when people talk about post-colonial history of Latin America using terms, that have been borrowed from studies of India, for instance, is a completely different reality, because in some cases we are living in new colonialism. That is a history that keeps on repeating itself. Even if we are free societies, there's still the economic aspect, and whether it's the United States or China or whomever who's having a big presence and dominating the area, the area is still under a certain kind of economic colonial regime. So there's, I mean, it's something of more of a general consciousness that, you know, that we're all proceeding from the colonial history and the colonial past. I mean, some artists have made that the basis for their work, and many of the abstract artists who originally started with the constructivist movements, we can think about the School of the South. You know, they certainly went back to the colonial motifs, I mean, pre-Columbian motifs, and there's actually a feeling which was was first expressed by Joaquin Torres Garcia, who was one of the theorists and the pioneer and theorists of this movement, that whatever the European artists were trying to do with abstraction had already been achieved in Latin America through the indigenous civilizations such as the Inca and the Maya. And so the study, I mean, beginning with Torres Garcia, he begins to actually travel and study, you know, Tiwanaku, Cusco, and that has a very strong influence in his art, not directly in terms of, you know, representation of those motifs, but in terms of assimilating and integrating, you know, a kind of a general sense of structure, you know, and design that was very much present in those civilizations. Over the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen within the Latin American field a phenomenon of exhibitions, collections that have been formed, studies that are being undertaken at the level of dissertations, etc., all focus on the constructive and geometric traditions, which 10 or 15 years ago, they were completely forgotten. You know, this was Latin American art. For many years, there was a kind of stereotype in place that went from the idea of the fantastic, which was the Frida Kahlo type of work that was based on very lush nature, you know, exotic environments, strong colors, and you know, all of that kind of environment, you know, of the exotic and the fantastic being associated with Latin America. So we went from having that kind of stereotype, and also the stereotype of Latin American art being just political art, you know, with people, you know, with rifles and Che Guevaras and, you know, that sort of thing. So we went from that notion of Latin America, which was basically like all the stereotypes, founded on ignorance, of people not really knowing, and the fact that the field lacked depth at that time. So we went from that now to this exaltation of the constructive and geometric traditions, which are certainly amongst the most sophisticated art that has been produced in Latin America. I myself have done a lot of work with artists beginning with Torres Garcia, as well as, you know, Cruz Diez, Elio Itisic, Alicia Clark, you know, all of these artists from this period, and I believe that their work really is extraordinary and stands on its own anywhere in the world. But I feel that, like every canon, you know, when you get to the notion of a canon, you know, everything becomes fixed, and that doesn't provide any more opportunities for anybody else. So I really feel that, you know, it's time to kind of shift the conversation to areas that are still in need of recognition and legitimization. And I think that there are a number of artists in Latin America that have worked within the figurative tradition without abandoning the notion of the avant-garde. And those artists, we need to start taking a close look at them. I'm thinking of artists like Beatriz Gonzalez in Colombia, and magnificent, one of the first women artists who worked painting directly on furniture, a very radical proposal for the time. I'm thinking of people like Deborah Arango, one of the most incredible feminist artists in Latin America. Of course, you know, the dean of all of them is Antonio Berni from Argentina. But Berni worked in the figurative tradition, but he abandoned painting at one point and turned to the medium of assemblage and became one of the great virtuoso artists of that medium anywhere in the world. Latino art is a very complex area. It refers to all the artists of Latin descent, but working within the United States. And traditionally, it referred to groups like the Chicano Chicanos and Puerto Ricans and Cuban Americans were the three main groups. Chicanos, of course, are not immigrants. The Chicanos have been in the United States, sometimes preceding Anglo presence in the United States. So they are, a kind of a special group in that sense. Puerto Ricans are colonials, because we still belong to a colony of the United States. And Cuban Americans are a different group. But the reality is that today, the Latino landscape in the United States has gone far beyond those three initial groups. And we have more than 50 million Latinos from all over Latin America who are living in the United States and who are making the Latino community the largest minority group in the United States. And that, I have to say, is an unstoppable process that is also beginning to have a political impact in the national dialogue of the United States, as we saw with the Obama presidential election. So we are in a completely different terrain, completely different reality. As Gomez Peña said very early on in the 80s, the first world and the third world, have penetrated each other and they're living next to each other. And I think it's time to really start paying a close attention to what that phenomenon is producing. In my own experience, professional experience, I remember one year, about 3 or 4 years ago, where I was lecturing 1 month in Washington, D.C., and everyone, 300 people in the lecture room, most of them artists from all over Latin America. Something you would never expect in Washington, D.C. 20 years ago. I mean, it's not a city that you identify with Latinos at all. And then I go from Washington, D.C. to Portland, Oregon, which is another universe, another side of the United States. You don't even feel you're in the United States there. And it's the same thing. Artists from El Salvador, Honduras, Puerto Rico, Mexico, everywhere, they were there. So that tells me there's something going on that we need to pay attention to. However, the problem is that Latinos, because of their immigrant status, as well as, for the most part, their working class origins, do not enjoy the same degree of recognition as Latin American artists. So Latin American art, as I explained yesterday, has had a market presence because of the Sotheby's and Christie's auctions since 1979. And now, after 30 years, it's become, a hot commodity, in the global markets. Well, Latino art is still very far from that. And there are many biases, that are still at play. There are issues of class, there are issues of race, there are all sorts of issues that are competing against one another. And institutions in the United States are facing a conundrum because they don't know how to address this. And I remember, the situation is changing right now, but 20 years ago, I remember a very important museum director from a major museum on the West Coast calling me to see how they could start addressing the issues of the Latino community. And when I said, well, what is it that you have in mind? And he says, well, we want to buy Wilfredo Lam and Diego Rivera and all of that. And I said, that has nothing to do with your Latino community. I mean, that, if you want to do something here, you have to buy your local artists, and forget about Wilfredo Lam and all these people. Because it's a separate phenomenon. That's a market phenomenon. So, that problem is still very much alive. And now you see many of the major art institutions saying, well, we need to pay attention to our Latino audience, but they have no clue how to begin to do that. I don't know of any one museum collection that has, begun to incorporate them systematically. Obviously, contemporary art, yes, you have, artists who have been incorporated. I don't think that there is no museum. There is a project in Washington, D.C. to create a Latino museum. And I do have to say that the Museum of American Art in Washington, D.C. has begun to put together a collection of Latino art, but that's still a very timid, effort. And they recently put together an exhibition. They have a curator of Latino art. So you do have to give them credit that there is something beginning to happen. The Los Angeles County Museum of Art is one of the most active in that area in terms of having recently done important surveys and working, I guess, I don't know if they're incorporating the artists or not, but certainly they do have an active relationship with the Los Angeles community, which is a very important center for Latino art. But for instance, in terms of archives, when we talk about the infrastructure of archives in Latin America, as I said, it's a very precarious one. When we talk about the situation of archives of Latino art, it's non-existent. You know, I mean, they don't exist. And most of the effort that we have done in that area for the ICAA Digital Archive has involved people literally knocking on houses and pulling, you know, boxes of documents from under the abuelita's bed, you know, or from the closet, because that's the state in which these things are. So there's a lot to be done with Latino art at the infrastructure level, as well as, you know, collecting and exhibiting and promoting the art.